Mr. Cotton-Smith wants to start.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You can start, Noel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Yes, very good. Very good. Well behaved. Thank you. Nice numbers tonight. Thank you for coming to mark the 75th anniversary of the death of Colin Grazier, with a talk by Mr. Steve Dunn, who is going to give us something entitled, remind me.
Heroism in the Great War Navy.
Heroism in the Great War Navy. I'm glad he could say it, because I can't. Housekeeping, you all know where the exits are, and this, that, the other. I'm not going to go, so I'm going to pass straight across to the gentleman behind me and go and take my seat to push a button.
Good evening. Incidentally, my lawyers have asked me to say that's not a guarantee. Yes, the value of your evening may go up as well as down. Terms and conditions apply. I'm Steve Dunn, author of 5 books on the Royal Navy of World War I, with another to be published in 2018 and a 7th commissioned for 2019. Today, I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, take questions if there are any, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to purchase copies of my books, which I will sign for you, thus ensuring that they will be worth millions in the event of my demise, which might be quite soon because I've got man flu. We're all here in this lovely church to honour the memory of local man Colin Grazier on the 75th anniversary of his death. 22-year-old Colin died saving vital code books from a sinking U-boat on this day in 1942. Code books which directly helped the Bletchley Park Enigma team in breaking German ciphers, and he was awarded the George Cross for his bravery. And the citation read, "The King has been graciously pleased to approve the posthumous award of the George Cross to able seaman Colin Grazier for outstanding bravery and steadfast devotion to duty in the face of danger." Now, in acting as he did, Colin was carrying on a tradition of selfless naval courage, which perhaps reached its apogee in the Great War. For in this conflict, the 19th century crashed into the modern world with the resultant horrific slaughter across the globe. Most people know of the carnage on the Western Front and believe the First World War was won there. But there's a strong case, and I make it in my later books, that the Royal Navy was critical to Britain's winning of World War I. Because around the British Isles, the Royal Navy exercised command of the sea. The Germans were never able to interfere with the transport of soldiers and materiel to France. They were never able to interdict Britain's trade to the extent that Britain might starve. Germany did starve, and that was because of the Royal Navy blockade, which ensured that neither war materials nor food reached Germany by sea. Command of the sea won World War I as much as the battles on the Western Front, a fact that's been, frankly, strangely forgotten today, as has the fact that during World War I, over 50 Victoria Crosses were won by members of the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy had to make it up as it went along. The regular Navy has acted as a sort of world policeman, putting down colonial rebellions and showing the flag. By 1914, it had not fought a major action for 100 years. And furthermore, torpedoes, mines, and U-boats were all relatively new concepts and poorly understood. It was an experience where admirals and captains had to learn both the game and the rules as they went along. And so did their men. And so, my lecture today continues the theme of Colin Grazier's courage and is entitled Heroism in the Great War Navy, with examples culled from my books. Now, Colin Grazier was born in 1920. The world he grew up in was heavily influenced by the example of the Great War and the Victorian and Edwardian culture which had made that world. So let's start by examining why the First World War produced so many heroes and so much heroic behaviour. Behind this self-sacrificing bravery lay a vital cultural imperative, one forged in the crucible of Vicwardian education, self-perception, imperial grandeur, and societal expectations. The dominant moral codes of the Victorians and the Edwardians that followed them were derived from their reverence for the chivalric, the lost Eden of Arthurian legend, Camelot, the Round Table, and their obsession with England as a new Rome. The educational system was founded on the classics for that very reason. The ancient Greeks and Romans were seen as great exemplars to imitate, their legends and myths as modern moral codes to be followed. The Odyssey and the Iliad could be recited by any educated schoolboy. And of course, there was a strong religious element to the chivalric. The Christian ethic of love and self-denial, of putting others before oneself. Old Squire Brown in Thomas Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days, when dispatching Tom to a public school, says, "If only he will turn out a brave, helpful, truth-telling Englishman, then gentleman and Christian, that's all I want." Chivalry and self-sacrifice, unspoken love and yearning, the pursuit of ideals and good deeds, the placing of women on pedestals, these were the tropes of the age. The seminal novels were books such as The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte M. Yonge, where the hero bears his trials with Christian fortitude and sacrifices his life in nursing his no-good cousin back to health. In art, a plethora of Galahads, Lancelots, Guineveres and Arthurs decorated studios and drawing rooms alike. Sir Edward Burne-Jones, The Last Sleep of Arthur in Avalon, was the painter's favourite of his works, and it represents one of the grandest of the Arthurian works. It's a sort of Arthurian apotheosis. You can see knights and damsels and dying for good causes, everything in that picture. He was, of course, Burne-Jones was, of course, a Brummie. He's one of us. He was born in 1833 in Birmingham, on Bennett's Hill, just above the station. And when he died in 1898, frankly, British art died with him. I'm sure all of you will agree with that. H.E. Luxmore, who was a master at Eton, gave his favourite departing pupils copies of G.F. Watt's painting Sir Galahad. And John Percival, headmaster at Clifton College, christened his sons Arthur and Lancelot. You don't meet too many Lancelots these days, do you? Henry Newbolt's 1892 poem Vitae Lampada, They Pass on the Torch of Life, became a shorthand for the times, and you know it. There's a breathless hush in the cloister night, 10 to make and the match to win, and play up and play the game. And Sir Walter Scott and W.E. Henley were more prosaic popularisers. You know, Henley, Invictus, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. William Morris was another powerful influence. His prose romance, The Well at World's End, which was published in 1896, the year he died, is a tale of young Prince Ralph in search of the redemptive and healing well at the end of the world. And it was read by virtually every literate man in England before the beginning of the war. And Morris's influence, in fact, extends to this church, for his firm produced the lovely and chivalric stained glass in the south clerestory windows and the chapel east window. And the chivalric code also governed the Victorian approach to personal bravery. In schoolrooms all over the country, the texts were Hector and Achilles, Horatio and the Bridge, Arthur and his knights, Childe Roland, Prince Rupert, Moore at Corunna, Nelson at Trafalgar, Gordon and the Dervishes, Captain Lawrence Oates' self-sacrifice in Scott's ridiculously amateur attempt on the South Pole, where he was beaten by the more professional Amundsen, who rued that with his death, Scott would be the one to be remembered, and in England at least he was. But Oates' sacrifice was held up in hundreds of books as an exemplar of chivalric and Christian courage. Personal bravery was an expectation. It was inconceivable that a Victorian man would behave otherwise. To be considered a coward was social and professional suicide. all of the education, the reading, and the peer pressure that people of that period were exposed to emphasized this, and they were in the thrall of the chivalric code imagined to pertain in medieval and Arthurian times. And woe betide if one failed to live up to this expectation. The anti-hero of my second book, The Coward, is Rear Admiral Ernest Troubridge. On the outbreak of war, Troubridge and his superior, Admiral Milne, a man famous for his statement, "They don't pay me to think, they pay me to be an admiral," received orders direct from the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, that they must intercept and sink the German battlecruiser Goeben, then cruising in the Med, whilst avoiding superior force, a badly expressed concept which Churchill had intended to mean the Austro-Hungarian Navy, should they sortie. Goeben was considerably outnumbered by the British forces on hand, but by dint of confusing orders from Churchill and the Admiralty, poor dispositions by Milne and a want of aggression, Goeben evaded interception and began a run for the safety of Turkish waters. On the 6th of August 1914, Troubridge and his squadron were well placed to catch and engage the German ship. He had with him 4 large armoured cruisers, sporting a mixed armament of heavy guns with a range of some 16,000 yards, a strong force capable of a combined broadside of 8,480 pounds of high explosive, and able, of course, to manoeuvre as 4 different gun platforms. And in company, he also had 3 light cruisers, not able to take a position in the line of battle, but with 8 destroyers, ideal for a torpedo attack. Troubridge gave orders that he intended to engage, manoeuvred to intercept, and then at the last moment withdrew, turned away from battle, and signalled Milne, asking him what he should do. The Goeben escaped to Turkey and triggered a sequence of events which eventually led to the disaster of Gallipoli. Troubridge had become convinced that his ships were outranged by the enemy. But that didn't matter. His behaviour was not in the heroic tradition of the Royal Navy. He was court-martialed for cowardice, found not guilty on the basis of confusing Admiralty orders, but never allowed to serve at sea again. Socially, he was ostracised. His wife left him, even worse for another woman, and he died a sad figure, exiled from his homeland through the constant innuendo and gossip that followed him round Britain. Troubridge believed that he was a victim of Churchill's confusing orders. Another of Churchill's victims was Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Kit Cradock, the hero of my first book, The Scapegoat. Cradock died a hero's death on All Hallows Day 1914 off the coast of Coronel, trying to gain command of the seas by engaging the German squadron of Admiral Graf von Spee. Von Spee's ships were the German Navy's crack gunnery squadron. They outshot, outranged, and outsped Cradock's ships, which had been plucked out of the Naval Reserve, technically called the Third Fleet, where they'd been laid up for scrapping. And they were crewed with a scratch team of mainly reservists and boys. Cradock's ships comprised the obsolete, the obsolescent, and the unusable. He repeatedly represented to the Admiralty that his force was inadequate for the task allocated. He asked for a big, fast armoured cruiser, HMS Defence, a match for any of von Spee's ships, and was told it was on its way. But her orders were changed, and nobody told Cradock. Nonetheless, Churchill insisted to Cradock that his force was sufficient to take on Admiral Graf von Spee's modern squadron, and virtually accused him of cowardice. And in the Navy, orders are orders. Even admirals have to do as they're told. But there was another cloud hanging over Cradock as he prepared for his final battle. The reputation of the Royal Navy had been severely tarnished by some events in 1914 when ships were needlessly lost. And Troubridge's assumed cowardice had cast a shadow on Cradock's beloved Navy. Kit Cradock knew of this, and he knew of the perceived disgrace to the Navy and to Troubridge. It troubled him deeply, and he was determined that neither he nor his squadron should face similar shame. In a letter to the governor of the Falkland Islands, just before his final battle, he noted, "We don't want any more disappointments." And so Cradock set sail to find his enemy, having first buried his sword and medals on the Falkland Islands, for he knew, and so did all the men that crewed the ships, that they were sailing to their deaths. But orders are orders. Von Spee opened fire at a range of 12,300 yards. That's about 7 miles. Cradock had only 2 guns in his squadron that could fire as far as the Germans, and one of them was knocked out when Von Spee's flagship's 3rd salvo hit Cradock's flagship Good Hope forward gun position. And as for Cradock's 2nd armoured cruiser, the Monmouth, her 6-inch guns were useless at that range, even in a calm sea. Hence Cradock's desperate attempt to close with his enemy at all cost will be picked off at Von Spee's leisure. Both British cruisers, the Good Hope and the Monmouth, were sunk with the loss of all their crews, 1,600 men in total. It was the worst Royal Navy disaster in over 100 years. They died heroes' deaths, as they were expected to do. Vodka. I wish. HMS Formidable was an ageing battleship built in 1897, displacing over 15,000 tons and armed with 4 40 caliber 12-inch guns and 12 6-inch quickfirers. I just put the technical bits in case anyone from the Navy's crept in. She carried a crew of 780. 780, it's like a small town. It's a village floating. By 1914, she was obsolescent, part of a squadron intended to guard the Channel against the threat of invasion. On New Year's Day 1915, in atrocious sea conditions and at 2:20 in the morning, she was torpedoed by the submarine U-24. The torpedo struck Formidable amidships on the starboard side under the forward funnel, exploding directly beneath the bridge and blowing a hole the size of a proverbial bus in her side. It also put out of action the ship's dynamo room and therefore robbed her of lighting and power for the wireless and other electrical apparatus. In this, Formidable was actually doubly unlucky because between January and September 1915, nearly 2/3 of German torpedo attacks failed through faulty triggers, defective steering mechanisms, or dud warheads. Vorsprung Dirk technique, I suppose. Captain Noel Loxley was on the bridge when the explosion occurred. His immediate thought was that it hit a mine. It being the middle watch and the ship stood down from action stations, the majority of the men were below decks sleeping, some 500 in all. More were in the engine and boiler rooms too. Loxley swiftly followed standard procedure, ordering all watertight doors to be shut and sounding collision stations by bugle. He turned his ship, which has already taken a severe list, into the wind and into the rising sea. Water was pouring into the battleship and started to flood the engine room. Fire was drawn from the boilers to reduce the risk of an internal explosion, and as a result, the steam pressure fell to 0. To counteract the list, Loxley ordered the gunners to train the 2 big guns on the beam, but the hydraulic pressure had gone and the turrets couldn't move. Stumbling up from the dark bowels of the ship, sleep-drugged, undressed, or in pyjamas and unwary, men began to arrive on deck and at their collision posts. By now, the ship had assumed a 20-degree list to starboard and was drifting without power or lights in conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. Slowly, the old girl was dying. But amidst the chaos and the darkness, the crew remained heroically calm. Men stopped to salute their officers. Someone played ragtime on the piano until the piano was thrown overboard to act as a potential raft. It was clear to Loxley that his ship was very unlikely to survive, and he ordered the ship's boats to be launched. Formidable carried a full complement of auxiliary boats, but the angle of her list meant that only boats on the starboard side could be used. Only 5 got away in the weather, and only 2 survived. Meanwhile, aboard U-24, her commander wanted to make sure of his kill. So seeing his victim had not yet foundered, he worked round to her port side and fired another torpedo. This one hit below the after tunnel in number 1 boiler room. It was Formidable's death warrant. She started to settle, lying lower in the huge seas which now broke over her main decks and rushed into her hull, both through the external wounds and through the topside vents and doors, trapping many men in the engine room and boiler spaces. On the bridge, Loxley knew his ship was finished. Standing there with his commander and a signalman, he gave the order to abandon ship. His dog Bruce stood with him. None of them were ever seen again. As the old lady began to sink into the rough seas, it became every man for himself. Many jumped into the enormous waves and were immediately drowned or dashed against the ship's side. And she slipped down by the bow like a maiden's curtsy and wearily turned over onto her starboard side. Those who had clung to the illusion of safety on the deck and grabbed hold of the port guardrails just slid down the hull to bash against the bilge keel and then fall battered and helpless into the sea. Others fell rather than slid, so steep was the incline across the deck, smashing into the turrets and other impedimenta and horribly injuring themselves. Just after 4:30 in the morning, she died and began the descent to the bottom of the English Channel and her final resting place 20 miles south of Lyme Regis. Formidable had just gained the unwanted distinction of being the first Royal Navy battleship to be sunk by a locomotive torpedo. 583 men and boys died that morning. Only 2 boats were successful in escaping from the shipwreck, each carrying 70 men. In hurricane conditions and mountainous seas, they fought for their lives. Ordinary men became heroes. Men rowed until their hands bled and their muscles cracked. Others clung onto makeshift masts or held oars used as tillers. Men and boys died of exposure and were thrown overboard to reduce the weight. Others went mad and jumped over the side to their doom. One of those boats would surely have been lost if it was not for the heroism of a Devon fisherman, William Pillar, 30 years old, married, and the owner of the sail fishing smack Provident. He was an experienced seaman and second coxswain of the Torbay lifeboat, and he'd participated in many rescues. Now he faced his biggest ever challenge. Captain Pillar had been running for shelter himself in the teeth of a gale and mountainous seas. He'd hove to when his third hand, John Clark, thought he saw something. In flailing wind, Clark shinned up the rigging to get a better look and then reported to Pillar that there was a boat in trouble. As a lifeboat man and as a fellow sailor, William Pillar knew he had no choice but to attempt to rescue. For him and for the survivors of Formidable, it was to be a defining moment. As Provident approached the boat, he could see that she was full of water and leaking badly. He had to act quickly, and in doing so showed magnificent seamanship. With the utmost difficulty, he jibed his trawler and manoeuvred to windward, trying to get the cutter into the shelter of his lee. Eventually, after 4 attempts and nearly 3 hours of trying, he managed to get a line on board the little boat. Using his steam capstan, Pillar was able to pull the launch round to the trawler's stern, enabling the sailors to begin to jump on board. The waves were 30 feet high. That's higher than a double-decker bus, and made the task even more dangerous and difficult. It took half an hour to get all the men onto the trawler, but Pillar did it. And as the last man left the shattered little boat, it broke up and sank. But for William Pillar, 70 men would be dead. It is difficult at this distance to appreciate the skill and heroism displayed by the crew of the Provident. One survivor, Seaman Gunner Hughes, who had held the tiller for much of the ordeal, said of Pillar, "I could not say too much in praise of that man. Heroes do not have to wear uniforms. The cultural ethos of the era permeated all levels of society." Bar's a bit long, I have to go and get my drink. And I daren't put it on that music stand because it'll fall off into that bag. Germany was beaten in World War I because Britain never lost command of the sea. The blockade of Germany, which eventually resulted in widespread starvation in that country and broke the resolve of both citizens and soldiers, was conducted in the northern North Sea and the Dover Strait. My most recent books, Blockade and Securing the Narrow Sea, deal with those campaigns. The Northern Patrol, conducted by the 10th Cruiser Squadron, was an arduous and difficult duty. The ships involved were armed merchant cruisers, passenger liners, converted to makeshift warships, and crewed by a sprinkling of regular naval officers and a lot of volunteers, RNR or MMR. Bravery comes in many forms. Sometimes it's just the sheer determination to carry on in the face of impossible or psychologically destroying circumstances. Listen to Commander England, captain of the AMC HMS Orvieto. Here he is on the occasion of his 40th birthday. He notes in his diary, "I can't shake off this flu or cold or whatever it is, and I'm plagued with neuralgia." And a little later he recorded, "I can't sleep at night, and I'm feeling rather worn." Melancholy could set in. In October 1916, he confided to his diary, "I love Margie and Bet and Puss," they were his children, "and wish for them happiness, riches and honour, but still more the salvation of their souls and the light of truth. And I too crave the salvation of my soul and the quenching of doubt, that we may all dwell together in eternity and that all separations may be but temporary. And I who wish for this am a very sinful man." Others found the strain simply too much. HMS Kildonan Castle docked in Glasgow at the conclusion of her first duty on the blockade. Here it was discovered that her captain, Commander Cardale, had been suffering from excessive thirst and had the DTs. This came to light when he sent for the Glasgow Chief of Police and reported that the ship was full of German and Austrian officers. He was quietly relieved on the 19th of December and sent to the Navy's Haslar Hospital, where he stayed for the remainder of the war. The other end of the North Sea blockade was managed by the Dover Patrol, the subject of my book, Securing the Narrow Sea. Few people today have heard of the Dover Patrol, and if they had, it's usually only in the context of the Zeebrugge and Ostend raids of 1918. And yet theirs was the longest continuous naval operation of the war, and without it there'd have been no British army in Europe. As the author Paul Unwin has put it, for troops on their way to the front and coming back across the Channel for leave, and in hospital ships, the Dover Patrol kept them safe, securing the Channel against a German invasion threat that would have cut the British Army off from home. And the historian William Philpott noted that the Allied navies held and kept the seas against German submarines throughout the war, enforcing an ever tighter blockade that starved enemy populations and by 1918 had severely degraded the Central Powers' ability to manufacture war materials. In the narrow seas of the Channel, and often at night, British and German light naval forces fought a vicious battle. For example, on the evening of the 20th of April, 12 German torpedo boats set out from Zeebrugge with the intention of attacking the Channel Net barrage and associated drifters and support vessels. Defensive minefields presented them reaching their objective, so instead they contented themselves with attempting a bombardment of Dover and Calais. 6 vessels targeted each port. I want you to imagine it's dark. Black dark. Wine dark. Stygian dark. So dark you can't see your mate next to you. It's 01:45 in the morning. You're commanding the RN flotilla leaders, HMS Swift and HMS Brooke. You might be Commander Edward Radcliffe Garth Russell Evans of the Brooke, known to his friends as Teddy, and a famous polar explorer. He'd been second in command on Captain Robert Falcon Scott's disastrous amateur expedition to the South Pole of 1910-13. He actually accompanied Scott to within 150 miles of the pole on foot, but became seriously ill with scurvy and only narrowly survived the return journey. In one way, he was lucky, of course, because although he nearly died, he at least survived. Scott himself and the rest of his party did not. Called back to active service in 1914 from the lecture circuit, he always sailed with a stuffed penguin mascot strapped to the mast of his vessel in recognition of his exploits. So let's imagine you're Teddy Evans. Suddenly, you see emerging from the night 6 ships. Are they yours or are they German? A fire gong on the leading ship of the line puts an end to confusion. They fire on you. And Swift returns fire and torpedoes an enemy vessel, but she takes injuries and loses power. On Brooke, you snap out your orders. Full speed, harder port, open fire, 3 siren blasts, stand by to ram! Your helmsman is badly wounded, but clings to the wheel, and at 27 knots steers your ship straight into the side of an enemy destroyer. Brooke is embedded in her victim, with a crash that was heard all over Kent. Let's stop the imagining now, because what happens next is beyond narration. Commander Evans ordered a rapid cannonade, sweeping the German decks with gunfire, whilst his enemy did the same. Men were mown down on both sides. Of the 18 men working Brooke's forward guns, soon only 5 were left standing. But Midshipman Donald Giles, RNR, a 19-year-old merchant apprentice co-opted into the Royal Navy, kept 1 gun in action, despite severe shrapnel wounds to his eye and his leg and his arm. The Germans now tried to board the Brooke to end the carnage and swarmed over the forecastle. Giles, armed only with a pistol, stood tall and fired at them. One German sailor, a regular giant, flung himself onto Giles from behind and tried to take the pistol off him, but was in turn run through with a cutlass by a British rating. To the Nelsonian call of "Repel boarders!" a pitched battle of pistols, rifles, sailors with cutlasses, and marines with bayonets broke out on Brooke's decks, which ended with Evans' men proving triumphant and sweeping the Germans into the sea. And throughout the action, Evans stood on the bridge bellowing to his crew, "Remember the Lusitania, men!" When the fighting was over, the 2 British ships had attacked 6 German destroyers and sunk 2 of them, despite suffering some damage themselves. In the dark days of early 1917, it was a welcome victory and a welcome riposte. Evans was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and advanced in rank to captain. He was feted by the press and the propaganda machine as Evans of the Brooke. And Midshipman Giles, too, became a temporary hero. On his release from hospital in Deal, he was sent home to Hornsey, where the newspapers made much of his ordeal. His quondam headmaster at Stroud Green Elementary School, one Mr. H.W. Christmas, described him with no doubt some vested interest and pride as a typical product of the modern elementary school. Brooke lost 21 men killed and another 36 wounded. Swift had 1 fatality and 4 wounded. And the German appetite for such raids was reduced. There were no more German surface raids in the Strait for 10 months. Incidentally, in 1945, Teddy Evans was ennobled as Lord Mount Evans, and his grandson was Lord Mayor of London last year. Amazing what you learn when you come to places like this, isn't it? heroes sometimes need a break. They have human weaknesses. 2 deckhands on the drifter Girl Annie, fishermen temporarily enlisted in the R&R for duty tending the net barrage and minesweeping, are an example. Tiring of an evening's entertainment at the Dover Hippodrome, they saw through the window of the gallery a cask of beer sitting temptingly below them. They scrambled out and slid down the drainpipe, opened the door of the yard, and were able to roll the barrel towards the harbour and their vessel. But this proved very thirsty work. And halfway there, they tapped the cask, and in the absence of any glasses, they drank up from an old paint tin. Their pleasure was attenuated by the arrival of the local constabulary, and the evening ended in the police station cells. In the magistrate's court the following day, they were arraigned before a strict teetotaler, an ex-regular Navy man, one Captain K, who inquired of the officer representing the control, Commander George Venn, R&R, as to the men's character. "Your worship, these are 2 very good men at sea. I hope you will fine them and not imprison them, as their services are valuable to the patrol, and I am sure Chief Constable Fox will vouch for the general good behaviour of the drifter patrol." Fox did so, and the men were then subjected to a long lecture on temperance before Kay dismissed them, saying, "These men will be punished by the naval authorities, of course." "Oh yes, of course, sir," said Ben. Now they had to face naval discipline, and the next morning appeared before Commander Case, RN. Case said, "Well, Commander, what do you have to say about these men?" Ben replied, "Exceptionally good at sea, but seem to play the fool on shore, sir." "Yes, so I should imagine," said Case. "Well, this time, and as the commander says you work well and are valuable to the patrol, and as some people are such damn fools that they cannot lock up their beer, you can go, dismissed." My forthcoming book, Bailey's War, deals with the battle for command of the seas in the western approaches off the coast of Ireland. And amongst the vessels that were deployed in that campaign were Q-ships, slow merchant vessels fitted with concealed armament, meant to look like a harmless merchantman to draw a U-boat near when it could then be attacked. And captains of Q-ships would go to any length to attract a submarine towards them to give them a chance of sinking it. On the 17th of February, Commander Gordon Campbell in the Farnborough, a Q-ship designated Q5, was steaming 40 miles to the south and west of Ireland, in the heart of the western approaches. At 09:45, he sighted a torpedo track and altered course and speed so that the torpedo would hit him. Now, that's not generally what you do, is it? The missile duly hit aft by the engine room bulkhead, and the blast injured the engineer sub-lieutenant, knocked down Campbell and some of his men, and most regrettably blew the ship's cat overboard. But it also inflicted serious damage to the ship. The machinery spaces were flooded, and Engineer Lieutenant Len Lovelace and his men had to lie on their faces on gratings on the top of the engine room compartment as she settled down by the stern. But the crew were well disciplined, and a panic party took to the boats with a great show of alarm and disorder to convince the U-boat that they were abandoning. Campbell, his second-in-command, Lieutenant Stewart, Len Lovelace and his men and the gunners remained on board, lying prone on the deck out of sight. The U-boat came closer, underwater. She came so close that Campbell could see her outline only 20 or 30 yards away from his ship. Then she surfaced about 300 yards on the port bow, where none of Q5's guns could bear, and began to move towards the panic party's 4 lifeboats on the port quarter. As she came abeam, Campbell from his hiding place could see her conning tower was open and her captain was on the bridge. If you ignored the fact that Campbell's ship was sinking, it was the perfect setup. At 10:10, he gave the order, and some 45 shells were fired at close range. The very first shot decapitated the German captain, Bruno Hopp, and the U-boat U-83 was rapidly reduced to a wreck. 8 German sailors escaped the submarine, but before it sank, but only 2 could be pulled from the water, one of whom subsequently died of his wounds anyway. Hopp had sunk 6 ships on that cruise and 16 in his career. He would sink no more. But Farnborough was also in sinking condition from the torpedo damage. Realising this, Campbell left his men in the boats, destroyed all confidential papers, and radioed Queenstown, his base, for assistance. His somewhat orthodox style came through in his message, which read, "Q5 slowly sinking, respectfully wishes you goodbye." Eventually, he and his men were rescued. For his bravery and courage and the self-sacrificing way in which he claimed his victim, Campbell was awarded the Victoria Cross. An award, incidentally, also given to someone baptised in this church on Christmas Eve 1915, Samuel Parks, who won the VC at the charge of the Light Brigade. And with that rather contrived segue, we come to the end of this talk. Colin Grazier died, as I hope you now better understand, in an honourable tradition of selfless bravery founded on the morals and mores of the Victorian era, which are, regrettably, no longer honoured in this island. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have been, thank you very much for listening.